the focus of my presentation, I was told, should be the theme of this conference, and that is reimagining housing from challenges to opportunities. Now, when I looked at that, I asked myself, let me start by setting a context. And what I put at the context is to look at developing countries around the world, and then come home to Africa, and then particularly to Nigeria. And I found there are 5 common deficits that run through them all. Food deficit, energy deficit, manufacturing deficit, infrastructure deficit, and then the essence of this conversation, housing deficit. Really the big one. Now, all of this reflects in varying degrees in Nigeria, as we are not producing enough. Now, as already mentioned by some speakers here, and we saw that in the highlights, estimated housing deficit in Nigeria is about 28 million units, maybe more than that, depending on who is looking at the numbers. But while the conversation was going on during panel discussion, I quickly ran the numbers through my head. Now, population of Nigeria estimated, like Prof said now, is 237 million people, but growing at the rate of 2.5% annually. And I said, if I play those two against each other, the growth rate of the population and then the housing deficit, what that tells me then is that if we are going to effectively bridge the housing deficit, we need to deliver 1.93 million units annually over the next 15 years. Notice I said 15 years. So not 10, 15 years. So now, the important question is, how do we construct and deliver more than we do today? Now, we must also do this in context of what is happening globally. We no longer talk about VUCA. VUCA became a common acronym, a terminology that evolved during COVID in 2020. But now we talk about BANI. We operate in a world of BANI nowadays, B-A-N-I, which means the environment we are in is brittle, the environment we are in is anxious, it is non-linear. That means you can't rely on what you did yesterday or knew yesterday. And of course, the fourth of them, incomprehensible. And there's no better illustration of that than when you play what is happening with Trump 2.0 and the rest of the world. I won't say more than that. But in the light of that, I came across this statement. Of course, the author is unknown, but it goes simply this way. Everything is going to be fine in the end. If it is not fine, then it is not the end. Everything is going to be fine in the end, but if it is not fine, then it is not the end. That means we continue to interrogate information, data, knowledge, whatever is available, until we get to the solution we are looking for. Now, real estate, and especially housing development in Africa, grapples with 7 major challenges. We talk about it repeatedly. We just dealt with one of them. And of course, I so much fell in love when I heard what Egypt is doing about mortgage financing, which of course is one of the elements I also raise here. Now the challenges, dearth of accessible long-term financing. I was privileged to be the keynote speaker yesterday at an event, a stakeholder event that commissioned the recently inaugurated Nigerian Credit Guarantee Company, which I happen to be one of those advocating for it in the last 20 years in Nigeria. But I will not go into that, but the whole essence is to also create access to funding, which of course we see happening in over 100 countries around the world. But it's only now we are getting into that space. Tenuous property titling, we just listened to that. Weak or non-existent dedicated institutions that is, institution dedicated to housing. And of course, high housing construction costs. Then poor infrastructure. We heard from our moderator just now the importance of infrastructure. Of course, low access to mortgage, and then weak, non-existent, or unforceable foreclosure laws. Now, let me start with this. If we want to reimagine real estate, and that terminology, reimagine, I came across about 20 years ago, no, 21 now, 2004, when a book was published by Tom Peters, titled by that word, reimagine, he said. And so I asked myself, if we are to reimagine housing today, how should we think? And how do we go about that? Which, of course, also reminds me of something, an article I came across in 1989, titled, "What is important is not what to think about, but how to think." And so I asked myself, how do I look at this? If it is to be reimagined, then it means, number one, we want to address those challenges in a different way than we had done historically. And to reimagine then is to approach the entire built value chain from a systems perspective and then embed innovations. Now, talking about systems, my mind went to the understanding of systems basically as organized things, but aimed at delivering a particular objective. So I came to the human body. The human body is a very interesting illustration of systems. It is made up of several systems, each of them working independently, but in harmony to protect this remarkable organism that we call the human body. And of course, you see there the circulatory system, the digestive system, the pulmonary system, the musculoskeletal system, and so on and so forth. But I picked on only one. And that is what is happening to every one of us here and every human being. Within the circulatory system, you have a heart at the center of it. Then you have veins, arteries, capillaries, that when you stretch them out, they will go around the earth, the circumference of the earth, twice. In one single pack of body. Capillaries, veins, arteries, when stretched out, will go around the earth twice. But now, here is the heart of a human being. The average heart beats 72 times in a minute. And that means 4,320 times in 1 hour. If you take a whole day, your heart, on the average, beats 103,680 times. If you take the space of 1 year, your heart beats for 37,843,200 times. But this is happening without you instructing your heart to beat. So in which case, when we reimagine housing, it should be about looking at the entire value chains and asking ourselves, which aspects of those activities and operations can we automate? And that is the direction I'm going to today. Now, addressing housing challenges, my first thought took me back to 1978 while I was still in the university as an undergraduate. And there was this subject, this course that I took, economic geography. And then we learned about a concept referred to as environmental determinism, which means the environment people live in determines how they live, how they relate, the kind of choices they make. So I said, can I bring that in context of this conversation today? Which means if we talk about housing, we recognize the diversity of the locations where those who need those houses are, the diversities in their cultures. Culture simply is the way of life of a people, all right? The diversity of how they make decisions and choices, the diversity of the resources available to them, and of course, any other thing we can imagine. So We can straight that concept, therefore, into our conversations at this conference, and then drive recommendations, one, on policy, then on innovations, and then on strategic partnership. And so, I then said, if we are going to do that, then we consider, for example, the terrain, the soil, the climate, the cultures, and preferences of people. Each time we are trying to imagine housing construction and delivery. So now, within that context, I said, let's look at funding. But that was the first challenge I mentioned earlier, the dearth of long-term funding. Long-term funding for housing developments is from three major sources, in my estimation. Governments, as has been mentioned also repeatedly here, through its agencies, through its institutions, and of course, what I call special purpose vehicles. Secondly, what I call patient capital, because housing needs long-term funding, and so for that to happen, you will need also patient capital from angel investors, quote and unquote. Then third is what I call commercial loans, all right? Now, the paucity of funds limits social housing development and delivery by governments, which increasingly also motivates public-private partnership in housing projects. And we heard that variously from the panel discussion and the immediate presentation that was made before I came up here. And that means when we talk about collaboration, we are looking at one between central and subnational governments on the one hand, and then looking also at the private and public sectors. But I'm going somewhere in what I want to leave with us today. Now, the involvement of the private sector also, we must remember, they are profit-seeking entities. It takes such projects out of social building context. So critical then to resolving the idea of long-term funds are three things. One of them was mentioned in the panel discussion, and that's by our guest from Egypt. De-risking. We need to de-risk that space for private capital to come into it. That's number one. Then secondly, the need to also build and sustain trust and confidence of stakeholders. Very important. And that means policies do not get changed at whims. So in which case, if I'm going to put long-term funding into a sector or a project, then I must also have an assurance that midway the policy will not change. Now, equally on funding, to de-risk funding of housing construction and delivery requires proper risk mapping. And of course, all along the entire built value chain. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, consider a special purpose vehicle for de-risking that is similar to credit guarantee. Now, credit guarantee is a popular scheme used around the world. As we speak today, there are about 2,250 credit guarantee schemes all around the world in over 100 countries. Now, we also need to ensure policy stability, as I said. But when we now come to land and property titling, which was mentioned, was addressed in the immediate past presentation, and this is where I want to recommend we depart from the old way of looking at things. Now, oftentimes, when we look at titling, we only look the way of government as the party responsible and to drive that. But I've learned from experience that even when something is within the purview of the government, there's a lot the private sector can also do to motivate that. And I'll give an example. In Nigeria today, the current National Adedipe project, which produced the need that we all have, I was privileged some 18 years ago to write the business plan for this current National Adedipe project. And that was in 2007. Now, when the idea was brought forward, our then President Obasanjo said, I'm not going to release one single kobo for National Identity Card project. And we said, okay, there's a way this can be done. Let's do it by way of public-private partnership, where the fund required for delivery of that project will be provided by private partners, and then we structure that for a 15-year period, number one. Then secondly, the back end of that project will be handled by the private partners, then the public-facing part will be handled by the government. And that was what we did in 2008 when we wrote the business plan. But today, a successful story. We're all carrying in now. But I can also assure you here, because I was involved, okay, that it was driven by the private partners, not by the public sector itself. Which means that if there are any changes in policy that can help fast-track delivery of housing units to bridge the gap we have today, we must take the responsibility to drive that and then collaborate with government in doing that. Now, also, most of the leading economies in Africa have a plethora of housing-related institutions. But a good number of those institutions are weak for diverse reasons of either weak capacity, we had that mentioned earlier by the panel. Secondly, poor capitalization. That also came in the panel discussion. And of course, on occasions, political interference. Now, possibly for me, private operators in the built environment should explore areas in which they may offer technical and capacity building. Oh, okay, it's up. All right, thank you. In fact, I thought you wanted to say, you give me 2 minutes. And I would have said, no, I don't need 2 minutes, because I'm actually wrapping up. Thank you for that. So now the idea is this, that where there is a lack of capacity, we can offer to provide that. I've been involved in many projects in Nigeria where we did that for government agencies. Of course, many occasions it is pro bono. But there's a terminology we describe it with, and that it is enlightened self-interest. Which case, help them build capacity so that they can give you quality service. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, now, if we are going to get any traction with funding affordable housing, then we need to democratize mortgage. And what we mean by that is this: mortgage must be available, it must be accessible and convenient, and it must also be affordable. So now my conclusion goes back to what I said on this platform last year. And that is simply to say, what type of housing do we need in Africa? It must be affordable. It must be locally adapted. It must also be smart. Like the case of Hong Kong that we listened to. And invariably, it must be sustainable. When I heard you mention 100 years, I was blown away that we can build houses that will last 100 years. That for me is sustainability. And then the picture you showed us about light and then breeze. And I said, this is the whole essence.